The Cowboys have hired their new head coach, Brian Schottenheimer. And the one thing that stood out to me in his press conference, he said, this will be about the players. And I'm going to give you my perspective as a player on what it means for the guys and this new head coach. When you look at Brian Schottenheimer, who was the Cowboys offensive coordinator for the last 3 years now, some may say, yeah, offensive coordinator by title, but he really didn't get a chance to call plays. But what he did get a chance was to be around these guys every single day. When I was with the Cowboys back in 2009 or 2011 or 12 or whatever it was, I experienced something very similar to what a lot of these guys are going to experience today. My head coach at the time, Wade Phillips. His offensive coordinator, Jason Garrett. And now I've been on record of saying this before. I felt like there may have been a little bit of sabotage there, but such is life, and you move on with it. The Cowboys decided they were going to move away from Wade Phillips and now promote Jason Garrett to be the next head coach. And I just want to give you a couple pros and cons of what that looked like for me as a player, for us as a team, and how they'll probably look at it as now with Brian Schottenheimer as the head coach and him now being in charge of the team. First and foremost, when you go from a coordinator to a head coaching position, there is a shift of power. A lot of times as the coordinator, you're kind of there, you have input, but you don't have the final say so. And when you have coordinators and when you have assistants and you have coaches, a lot of times the players, in order to get their message to the big dog, we would sometimes go through our coordinators. So whether that be players like CeeDee Lamb or Dak Prescott or Jalen Tolbert or Hunter Lipke even or Luke Schoonmaker, they a lot of times were coming to their offensive coordinator, who at the time was Brian Schottenheimer, and voicing their concerns and saying, hey, I would like to do this. I would like to do that. And now that Brian Schottenheimer is the head coach, coaches are like elephants. They never, ever, ever forget. I had the luxury of training receivers and tight ends for a long time as they were making their way from college to the NFL. And I would always tell players, be very kind to your position coaches and to your coordinators, because one day you may need a job and they may be in a position to give it to you. So for Brian Schottenheimer, when it looks at from a player, he knows, especially offensively, where his specialty lies at. He knows all the guys. He knows all the guys who showed up to offseason workouts. He knows the guys who knew what they were doing in the playbook. He knows the guys who were doing all the right thing that he asked them to do as an offensive play caller. So now that he's the head guy, that may play a little favor for those guys who are looking to continue their career with the Dallas Cowboys. But he also knows those guys who didn't. He also knows those guys who BS'd. He also knows those guys that griped and moaned. He also knows those guys that didn't give it their all, who didn't show up to these workouts. And now, a lot of that doesn't have to do with the players like CeeDee Lamb, because those guys are made men. But it's that second and third tier guys. Those guys who are looking, to stay on the team that sometimes can be on the bubble. That's what they have to look at. Now, defensively, while he may not have had, Brian Schottenheimer I'm talking about, may not have had a very close eye to those guys, he had some recognition and some remembrance of who those guys were. So now that he's come into a position of power, he's looking at who can I build my roster with the 53 plus guys. And so a lot of these guys now have to find their way. You saw the guys at the press conference. Make no mistake about it. Dak Prescott was there, as he should be. He was the main guy voicing what it would be like to have Brian Schottenheimer. He has the familiarity. He has the relationship with Brian Schottenheimer. But it's those other guys. It's those guys like Jalen Tolbert and Brooks and Flournoy and all those other ones who are Carsons of the world, who are trying to say, hey, coach, don't forget about me now that you're in charge. So for a lot of these guys that were in the locker room, you had to make sure that you were doing the right thing, because the guy that you may have voiced your opinion to before, who may have taken into consideration, is now the guy who gets the chance to call kind of the shots for the Cowboys. So Brian Schottenheimer goes from the offensive coordinator to the head coach. There's a lot of guys on this football team who have now added some some brownie points to the bank because they've been good soldiers for Brian Schottenheimer before. But there's a lot of guys now who will look around and look over their shoulder and saying, I may not have been the best soldier for Brian Schottenheimer when he was the offensive coordinator, whether that be on scout team, whether that be, doing some other things around the building. And that may not play well in your favor when it comes to being a player on this roster and beyond. I hope Brian Schottenheimer definitely has some success for all of our sakes. But if it's going to be about the players, I hope those players that were in the locker room left a good taste in Brian Schottenheimer's mouth and a good memory in his mind, because as he's checking names off the list, he's going to find out who was naughty and nice, and you may or may not be employed under Brian Schottenheimer. All right, man, that's my player's perspective and from what it is to go from a player who had a coach be a coordinator to now the head coach. We'll see what these guys do, and we'll see how Brian Schottenheimer breaks this thing out. Always keep DLLS Cowboys podcast, hit the notification and like button. Do what you got to do to make us a part of your everyday life, because don't get no better than this, baby. I'm out.
We all silly like the mayor.